All right. Well, hello and welcome to this month's Tech Talk. Today we'll be having a fireside chat with Sinan Aral. And so we're going to be talking about technology and the 2020 election and a bunch of different topics as it relates to social media. I'm Nate Fass. I'm co-director of the Psychology of Technology Institute and professor at USC Marshall School of Business. And I'll be co-moderating today's conversation.
And I'm Juliana Schroeder. I'm the other co-director of the Institute. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, the Haas School of Business. I also will be co-monitoring the chat. And just a quick note that we have the chat open, we have the Q&A open. We will get to as many questions as possible. So feel free to post your questions as they come up.
All right, well, let's jump right in. So we're really fortunate and excited today to have a leading expert on social media networks and the spread of misinformation, among other things, Sinan Aral. He's the David Austin Professor of Management at MIT, leads the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, and is the author of the just released book, The Hype Machine, How Social Media Disrupts Our Elections, Our Economy, and Our Health, and How We Must Adapt. Huge congratulations on that. It just was released last week, and the launch is going fabulously. Sinan is known for his groundbreaking research in social networks and social media, and his recent paper with colleagues, The Spread of True and False News Online in Science, is one of the most highly cited publications in 2018 and 2019. So welcome, Sinan.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Great. Okay, well, let's start out by, it's going to be a far-ranging conversation, but let's get a sense of what you've been doing for the last 20 years in terms of research. So maybe take us through kind of what you've been doing over the last 20 years in your research and how that's evolved over time.
Yeah, so I graduated I got my PhD at MIT at the Sloan School in 2007. Mm-hmm. And during my PhD studies, I focused on social media networks. And I was really interested in, there was a moment which I actually describe in the book where I sort of landed on my life's work, as it turned out, where I was taking statistics classes in the economics department at MIT. And we were learning all about the best linear unbiased estimators, which assume, as everyone knows in this audience, IID, right? So it's independent and identically distributed observations in your data. And then I was taking classes about the sociology of strategy and in sociology in general. And there was a lot of work there on networks, Mark Granovetter and Ron Burt and all of those authors. And so I was looking in the statistics text, which was telling me that everything in my models needs to be independent. And I was looking in the sociology literature and seeing just how amazingly interdependent our world is. And I said, wow, this concept of interdependence probably could explain a lot of the variance in these models over here. And so I said, wow, I'm hooked on this concept that we're all connected in these really important ways, and that digital connections are such an important conduit for emotions and information and perspectives and beliefs and behaviors. Mm-hmm. So I really started studying that in social media networks in the year 2000. And so throughout my PhD, I studied that. And then afterwards, I continued to study that. And it became essentially, looking at the flow of information over networks was really the beginning, the origins of it. But then I started to really think about the flow of behaviors and perceptions, and it really culminated in this notion of influence, or the thing that really kicked it into high gear, and what really is the backbone of the book, is when you introduce the problem of causal inference into that notion, right? So I can study the diffusion of information over a Twitter network or over an email network or over a Facebook network. But when I ask, why does this matter? What is the influence of this, or how does this change people's beliefs, perceptions, or behaviors? If I want to know how this affects voting or shopping or dating or the election or any of those outcomes, then I have to have a notion of causal inference, which is about how does the flow of information or the movement of messages over the network change people's behavior in voting, dating, shopping, or whatever it is.
Right.
And so we, as you mentioned at the outset, we designed and conducted a number of studies, experimental and natural experiments, so observational, but with causal inference or new causal inference techniques that try to really get at how social media networks affect human beliefs, perceptions, and behaviors. And that really has been the focus of my work largely for my career. I have a few offshoots of, as we all do, we have our, our curiosities that go beyond the mainstream, but the mainstream of the research has been that, what I just described.
Great, great. And I'm sure, some of the early scholars have this question. So how do you get access to that data to do that kind of research?
Yeah, so it began with essentially, most of the data, first of all, that I work with is controlled by companies, as we know. So it's Facebook, it's Yahoo, it's Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, WeChat. I've done studies with all of those companies. And the first set of companies that I started working with, it was really the core way to get access to the data was to demonstrate to them that to the business that they would be interested in the learning from the research, that you have to really give them a what's in it, a value proposition to them, where you get to ask the questions you want to ask without compromising your inquiry goals as a scientist, but you describe to them why they should care about the answers. And that was really the crucial step at the beginning. And to the second crucial step was to demonstrate to them that I took all of the security and anonymity and privacy concerns seriously, and that we had protocols in my lab that were written down and that all of the students and postdocs signed agreements to, where we had certain ways of handling the data that were secure and private. So that was really important. And then third, I would say, once I did the first couple of big studies, the rest of them became a lot easier because I could point to those and say, hey, but Yahoo, when I went to Facebook for the first time, I said, well, Yahoo just did one where we had data on 30 million people. Here's an example. Here's the paper that they got out of it. And then we did that with Facebook. And then after Facebook, I could go to Twitter and say, look, we just did a 2 million person experiment with Facebook. Here's the paper. Here's all the protocols we follow. And, so that makes them more comfortable that other people have been willing to do it.
So what do you see as like the key value proposition for looking at misinformation in particular? Do you just say like, wouldn't you like to quantify the extent to which disinformation exists on this platform? Are there other like value propositions you would put forth there to the companies?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that so with the Twitter study, that was actually more difficult to sell because that has a lot more downside for them than it does upside. But I have to say that Jack Dorsey was quite sort of civic-minded in his support for the research. He understood. So one thing that I argue in the book is that the true leaders of what I call the new social age on the platform side are going to be the ones that realize that their concept of shareholder value, that the ones who win in this space are going to be the ones that align their concept of shareholder value with the concept of societal values. And that's because while sort of polluting versions of short-term engagement optimization where, you're just spreading the most salacious, false, horrible material, maybe short-term profit maximizing, but it's not long-term profit maximizing because there will be a backlash. There will be a delete Facebook movement or a stop hate for profit movement, or there will be, more stringent regulations and so on. And so, Jack Dorsey has had a commitment to what he calls communication health for the last couple of years now. And I think in that sense, it aligned in that way with his interest. And I think he also has a civic, is sort of like a civic-minded approach to the necessity to do that kind of research.
Makes sense. I'm so glad that you brought up the problem of causal identification right away. That was something that was on our list to talk about. There's just these huge debates over the extent to which social media is causing some of these different potential consequences you're seeing out in the world. And so you mentioned that you're both running experiments and you're identifying sort of new ways to run naturalistic experiments. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you're doing that and how you work around the problem of causal identification in this space.
So just from a broad perspective, first of all, I think that in order to get our hands around what the impact of social media is on society, you cannot avoid this question about what is the causal effect of the movement of information through this technology on changing people's behavior, right? If you want to know what the importance or the effect of fake news is, you really need to know what does the spread of fake news do in terms of changing people's minds and changing their behavior. So from a broad perspective, the two questions that I get asked most often in the last 2 years as a business educator are, one, did Russia flip the 2016 US presidential election? And two, how do I measure the ROI to my marketing budget? Right? As a business school educator, those are the two things that people want to ask me the most.
Those are really different.
Okay. So
got the range there.
As I describe in the book, the answers to those two questions are the same. The same process goes into figuring out whether Russia tipped the 2016 election and what your ROI on your marketing spend is. Because really what you're trying to understand is what is the change in behavior that was created by the messages. In one sense, you have the Internet Research Agency. They spread 126 million messages to people on Facebook, 20 million, they reached 20 million people on Instagram, 10 million tweets to Twitter accounts with 6 million followers on Twitter, 43 hours of YouTube content just before the 2016 election. And the question is, what did that do to people's voting behavior, voter turnout and vote choice? And then if you're a business and you want to understand the ROI on your marketing dollars, you want to know, you put these persuasive messages together, ads, you distribute them to some number of people, you have exposures, and then you really want to know, did it change their shopping behavior? And that's why the answer to those two, as you say, Juliana, those two very different questions are the same, because the process of getting the answers is the same, I should say. And so in some cases, messages will be persuasive. In other cases, they won't be. In some cases, the reach and scope and targeting of those messages will be enough to make meaningful changes in behavior. For instance, in a presidential election, you want to know who saw those messages. Were they in swing states? What was the marginal change in voter turnout, vote choice? And as a business, you want to know, did this affect sales? What was the change in sales caused by these messages? So in both of those cases, you're interested in caused by. And if you're interested in caused by, then you have to have some sort of approach to causal inference. So we've done a number of very large scale randomized experiments on Facebook and WeChat and Snapchat and LinkedIn, asking questions about what the influence of messages flowing over those networks is, from job transmission, job outcomes, to advertising success, to exercise behaviors, and so on. And so experiments are a really good way to get at causal inference, but sometimes you don't have the opportunity to experiment. So we have done things like with Yahoo, we published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where we designed a dynamic match sample estimator, which is essentially propensity score matching for large scale network data. And then, for instance, we published another paper in Nature, which was about whether exercise is contagious. And we couldn't really run an experiment there because we couldn't randomly cattle prod some people to run, but not others. So we had to find a natural experiment. And there we used rainfall, weather, as a natural experiment because it affects some people's running. And if their friends are in geographies that are in uncorrelated weather regions, then that is a shock that affects one person but not their friend. So it can be used as what's known as an instrumental variable.
Yep.
And so, so my career has been essentially a series of projects on measuring through causal inference of various techniques the impact or influence of social media messages on beliefs and behaviors.
That's great. I can hear people taking notes as we speak. Very
Great,
clever.
that's so clever. I love that.
Love it.
Such an
I love it.
shot. Yeah.
So we're going to, you'll be systematically kind of painting this picture for us. And so in terms of the hype machine, how it works and all that, and kind of as another kind of foundation for that, we'd love to hear about the psychological underpinnings of how, social media works and how it's leveraging psychology and neurological principles to kind of get us hooked.
Yeah. So and Jake, thank you in the background for publishing all of the articles that we're talking about. That's really awesome. Really appreciate that. And I just posted my Google Scholar page, which has a whole bunch of citations to all the stuff. And if you want to see some of the most recent stuff, just sort it by year and work backwards from 2020. We have some brand new papers that are just out. So, wow. Nate, this chapter for me was one of the most fascinating. So I've got chapter 4 in the book is called Your Brain on Social Media. Mm-hmm. And it goes through all of the neuroscience evidence of what happens in our brains as we use social media. And your audience is probably familiar with some of that, but I'm not a neuroscientist, so I had to kind of go deep. I do have neuroscientist friends, like Emily Falk at University of Pennsylvania is a close friend. And so she was my Sherpa through that research, essentially. And she did read that chapter multiple times to make sure I didn't make any mistakes. But she's fantastic. And she does a lot of work that's very tied into what I do, except for she does it in fMRI machines to try and understand how the brain responds to social media messages and if that can predict behavior. And so let me just sort of tell you the crazy story that I uncovered as I was writing that chapter, which is essentially that our brain, so it turns out that the human brain is, very large relative to our body size, larger than almost all species, not all species, but we have one of the largest brains for our body size of any species on the planet. And we also have one of the largest neocortex ratios. So the neocortex relative to the rest of the brain, not the largest, but one of the largest. And a leading theory for why this is the case is called the social brain hypothesis, which essentially argues that human brains evolved to process social signals. And there's this great science paper by Jolly that was published in 1966. She was studying monkeys in Madagascar. I think they were mandrills or something like that. I can't remember the exact type of monkey now. But she proposed that one of the major catalysts for brain development in social species is the processing of social signals, the keeping track of the social hierarchy and understanding the mental models and what other people, in our case humans, are thinking about. So humans are fifth order intentional, which means, so if I know that Joe is African, that's first order intentional. If I know that Sally knows, that Jim knows, that Bob knows that Joe is African, that's fifth order intentional. And we're one of the only, we were long thought to be the only species that's fifth order intentional. So now there's like a new paper that posits that maybe a certain type of ape may also be fifth order intentional, but it was long thought that we were the only ones that are fifth order intentional. If you think about the social signals that our brains process, our social hierarchy is incredibly complex. So, we have organizations of hundreds of thousands of people. We collaborate at great distances all over the world over technology. And so our brains evolved over millions of years to process these social signals. And so it's almost unsurprising. The meteoric rise of social media is almost unsurprising because it's like tossing a lit match into a pool of gasoline. Our brains evolved to process social signals, and then we invented a technology that puts us in touch with trillions of these social signals every day in real time from millions of people. Likes, shares, comments, what my cousin ate for dinner last night, who went to the barbecue. Oh, he's hanging out with her in an Instagram post. You know, all of these social signals about our local and global social hierarchy scaled, you know, to the entire world in real-time messaging. It is what essentially we doused our brain with high octane gasoline with regard to how our brains have evolved. And social media is built for our brains. So Sean Parker told Mike Allen in 2017 that, yeah, you know, we designed it to affect the dopamine reward system. You know, you're supposed to get a little dopamine hit every time, you know, you get a like or a share, and that's supposed to keep you coming back for more. We've created these notifications, which are on a variable schedule. This is my son.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Kaya.
This is how you know this is happening live. It's real.
So they are on a variable reinforcement schedule, which means that we don't know when they're going to show up in terms of the lights or the vibrations of the phone or the pings. And so it keeps our brain, if my phone is here, it keeps our brain constantly thinking about, when am I going to get the next like or share or comment? And so that's going to keep us in tune with paying attention to it. And if you remember, obviously, we're all aware of Pavlov's experiments, where he conditioned dogs to salivate, not at the food, but at the bell that represented the food. Okay, it's the same exact thing here. And the chapter goes way deeper because it goes into, for instance, how when we get likes, I go through all the experimental neuroscience studies that study what happens in the brain when we use social media. So for instance, UCLA, just down the road from you there, Nate, did a study where they randomly assigned likes to Instagram style pictures that people were scrolling through. And what they found was that the assignment of more likes randomly to pictures turned down the response inhibition system of the brain, which means that as our kids are using, he's not using social media. As our kids use social media, when they see more likes on pictures that depict risky behaviors, their response inhibition systems are turned off or at least turned down as those pictures receive more likes. And so these are really important sort of things that we need to understand in terms of how social media affects behavior. And it all starts with the neurological foundation. The chapter ends with the neural basis for social influence, which is, what are the neurological and neuroscience bases of how social media messages might affect our behavior? And that is actually the entryway into the entire rest of the book, which discusses how does social media affect our behavior. And so in the future chapters where I discuss the very large scale experiments, I say, remember back to what's happening in the brain that we talked about in chapter 4.
You write about in your book a little bit ways in which we could try to update social media and change some of those psychological levers, like changing engagement by adding different buttons, like rather than just the like button. So what are some of the ideas you're kind of playing with in your mind there? What would be like interesting to look at, do you think?
Well, I mean, so the 4 levers that we have available to us to really affect the direction of social media are what I call money, code, norms, and laws. Money is the business models, obviously. So the attention economy is based on selling attention as a precursor to persuasion. That's advertising. That business model runs on attention, and attention is garnered through engagement, or measured, I should say, by garnering engagement. And so changing the business models or thinking about how the business models affect the design of the system is important. The code is, as you're discussing, the design of the platforms, but also the algorithms. The laws are obviously regulation. There's a lot of talk about all of the different regulatory questions around antitrust, privacy, free speech versus hate speech, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, fake news, political speech, and so on. And then norms, how we use the technology. I go into detail about that. The design is super interesting, right? Because the like button, the reason I call it the hype machine is because it's designed to hype us up. And it's designed to hype us up because that maximizes profit.
By the way, what exactly do you include in the hype machine? Like,
yeah,
what's the definition of that?
Yeah, so it's all the social media platforms as well as the users and all of the ecosystem. It's the social media industrial complex, all the third-party players that are part of it, including, there are third-party companies that are advertising companies, data companies, integrators, analytics companies, agencies. Cambridge Analytica, right, was one of those companies. As well as, the policymakers that are writing laws that have to do with it. So it's the entire social media ecosystem. I call it the social media industrial complex.
And why don't you put traditional media in there? Or how do you see that?
Well, to the extent that they use social media, they are in there. But this is not a book about television. So I don't really talk about TV or radio, except to the extent that they are on and use, and they do very much. I mean, all of these channels have a ton of reach on social media. And so they are part of it, but I don't focus on them. For instance, when I talk about fake news, I talk about this feedback loop into the mainstream news cycle, which is so important to understanding the spread and impact of fake news, because there are a ton of studies out now that claim that fake news is a small problem because it's a quote unquote small part of the media diet, which means we watch more TV than we look at social media. And therefore it's a small part of the diet. First of all, I'm not sure that's true. Yeah. Second of all, social media reverberates back into broadcast media. All of the fake news, and Pizzagate was covered extensively on CNN and Fox and everywhere else, and so there is a feedback loop into broader societal zeitgeist, like in the media and so on. But to answer your question, so the hype machine, it's called the hype machine because it hypes us up. It's the social media industrial complex. It's designed to hype us up because that's what generates profits in the engagement business model, the advertising business model that currently runs it. And it was designed to hype us up that way. And that's why we have a like button, which is built on popularity, but we don't have a truth button or a wholesomeness button or a this taught me something button. And why not? I mean, these are, in terms of societal values, a priori, blank slate, tabula rasa, there's no reason why like would be the one that we chose rather than taught me some educational or wholesome or, intriguing or, surprising or whatever. It's like, do I like it? And the reason it's like is twofold. One, it gives them a means of keeping score in terms of how many people like it. That's popularity, but it's also directly reports to the machine. And I do kind of I do, it's a machine. I mean, I call it a machine. It is a machine. It's machine learning in a technological design. And that tells the machine exactly what you, Nate, or you, Juliana, like. And therefore it helps then, it uses that data obviously to tailor the machine learning to then give you more of what you like, which is the feed algorithm or the people you may know algorithms.
So that's super interesting. So we'll get into some of the other levers that we can talk about. But you mentioned in the book that you feel like we're at a crossroads between, the promise and the peril of the hype machine. And in some ways, this is a crossroads that we've been born into as a human species. I mean, the first tool that we developed was the Oldowan, which is like chips of rock or whatever, early humans 2.6 million years ago, and it creates all kinds of opportunities, but also, you know, it could be used for violence and so on. And it feels like we've been dealing with this crossroads with every new form of tool and technology that we develop. What do you mean by that crossroads? But also, do you feel like this one is different or similar to those kinds of crossroads that we've been at before?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think that, you know, as a student of technology, I am not a, so, you know, there's a technological determinism view, and there's kind of like human agency. And my feeling is that, you know, the outcomes that we see in technology and society are a duality between technological influence and human agency. And so I describe in the book what I call the hype loop, which is the primary central process of social media. And that is a dynamic interplay between machine intelligence and human agency, where the machine side of the loop is what I call the sense and suggest loop. So the machine senses what we like, what we do, what we read, who we friend, and then it uses those signals to suggest new things to read, new people to friend, new products to buy, new people to date, based on what it senses we've liked in the past and done in the past. That's the sense suggest side of the machine human loop. The other side is the consume and act loop, which is we as humans, we consume those suggestions, we discard some of them, and we take some of them, we share some of them, we like some of them, we read some of the news articles, we do friend some of the people, but not others. So we consume all those suggestions and we act on some of them. And all of our decisions then feed back into the machine, which senses what we're doing, and it's an evolving loop. And that hype loop is what generates the outcomes that we see in society, whether it's polarization or whether it is, you know, the spread of fake news, or any of, you know, effects on voting or shopping, dating. And so we have had we started with a decade of techno-utopianism, where, you know, social media and digital technologies like it were going to connect the world, and it was going to enable collaboration and learning, and it was going to liberate people in far off lands, and it was going to, you know, bring truth. It was going to shine light on the truth, and all of bring economic opportunities, allow small businesses to reach their consumers without a middle person, and et cetera. And then we had a decade of techno-dystopianism, where Elon Musk said machine learning is going to, you know, AI is going to destroy the planet, and Roger McNamee, you know, wrote Zucked, and we have, you know, the Social Dilemma movie and surveillance capitalism, and, you know, it's techno-dystopianism. And I did watch the Social Dilemma this past week, and in fact, a bunch of my friends are in that movie, and I think it's a fantastic movie. It's a great movie. People should watch it. But I love the fact that it's a clarion call. It's sort of raising the red flag about the dangers of social media. But I wanted this book to transcend the techno-utopianism on one hand and the techno-dystopianism on the other hand, and to ask, you know, what do we do? What do we do? What can we actually concretely do to achieve the promise of social media and avoid the peril? I think that there are things that we can do. There are ways in concert we can pull the four levers of money, code, norms, and laws. And if all the oars are rowing together, we can kind of steer the ship away from the rocks and towards calmer waters, as it were.
And do you feel like, so at the Psych of Tech Institute, you know, we really are about developing and furthering the research that will help us take that middle ground that informs all of these levers. Can you talk a little bit more about the norms and the laws? Obviously, we need research in order to enact on those, but what do you mean by those?
Yeah, so let me start with the research and then work my way to the laws. So first of all, I talk at length about the need for transparency in the book, the need for these platforms to work with scientists, to let scientists in so that we can really understand how social media works and how it's affecting our society, our democracies, our economies, our public health. I mean, I talk at length, obviously, in the book about, you know, the spread of coronavirus misinformation. And I talk about the measles epidemics before that, or the measles outbreaks in the US before that. And I talk about its effect on the stock market and the economy and so on. So I call in the book for a national commission on democracy and technology, which would be populated with scientists as well as platform leaders and policymakers, activists, journalists, and so on, to really get a sense for how this technology is affecting our democracy and what can we do. Every time there's a hearing on C-SPAN, I pop a bowl of popcorn and I watch these people grill Mark Zuckerberg and others. And the first several were appallingly amateurish. The last antitrust hearing was a step up, but it's still not quite where it needs to be. We need more expert scientific opinions in this conversation because, you know, we as a group have been studying this for a long time. And so in terms of transparency, there are a number of ways initiatives to try and make this data available. So there's Social Science One, which was started by Nate Persily and Gary King. Nate is at Stanford and Gary is at Harvard. And I talk at length about Social Science One in the book, about how it was this great industry academic partnership, concept. It stalled at the beginning. They were almost 2 years. They didn't provide any data. And funders of Social Science One were going to pull out. Finally, Facebook provided actually a relatively large chunk of data, which was unprecedented, actually. So there's kind of good and bad news in Social Science One right now. In terms of regulation, the laws, the entire last chapter, which is the longest chapter in the book, is dedicated to what do we do? And it goes through every question, starting with antitrust, starting with should we break up Facebook, all the way through to privacy. Should there be federal privacy legislation in the US? How should it be different or the same as GDPR in Europe? What's the counter example of essentially the surveillance state that exists in China? Those are the three privacy regimes that we have in the world right now. All the way through to free speech versus hate speech, political speech, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, whether we should be regulating misinformation and the context in which that's regulated. Obviously, in authoritarian regimes, regulation of misinformation is used to stifle minority opinions. We see that very much, for instance, with my friend Maria Ressa in the Philippines right now, who is a journalist. Those of you who know her, she was one of Time's Person of the Year in 2018. She was just convicted on a cyber libel charge that she could go to prison for 7 years, and all under the guise of spreading fake news, as a tool to suppress opposition journalists. For instance, in the Philippines, we see this many other places as well. And we probably don't have time to go through all the laws now, but the competition question is an important one. The chapter 5 in the book is all about the economics of social media. And really there I get into network effects, and specifically local network effects, which is one of the 4 types of network effects. And it's the one that matters most. And it's also the least known type of network effect. It's the one that matters most in social media. And because of network effects, breaking up one company will not be as effective as structural reforms to the social media economy that are needed. What we really need is data portability, interoperability, social network portability, the ability to take your identity, your data, and your social network and move from one platform to another. Creating that kind of competition. There's a bill before Congress right now called the Access Act, which would mandate interoperability for any social network greater than 100 million users, which would affect most of the major ones that we know. And so that kind of legislation, that kind of structural reform of the economy is the entry ticket to turning this ship around, because without competition, there's no incentive, going back to the money, for any of these platforms to change their business models. Without an ability for consumers to vote with their feet, to move out of one social network if it's polluted with fake news, hate speech, and live streams of mass murders like the one in Christchurch, New Zealand, to another platform that is cleaner or does a better job of policing fake news or spam or does better with their privacy, then there will be no incentive for them to change. I think it's the essential first step to correcting all of the other market failures, from privacy to fake news to election integrity, that are covered in the book.
Yeah. Although I guess that assumes that consumers would be able to tell when they're receiving fake news to some extent. I mean, there's something
Well,
like that. Which
yeah,
I think brings us to a broader question of, how do you identify what's fake and what's true? And are there ways in which you can scale that? How are you thinking about that?
yeah. So, I think that there are, and I lay out about 5 or 6 things that we should be doing on fake news in the book. And one thing which gets to your question more directly is this notion of how do we know?
Yep.
And the solution that I talk about for that is labeling. And so when you go to the grocery store to buy food to consume, it's extensively labeled. You know how many calories it has, how many trans fats, whether it was produced in a facility that also processes wheat or peanuts if you have an allergy. But when you're consuming news on social media, you don't have any information about the provenance of that. How often does this source put out true information? What is the editorial policy of running with a fact on this source? What is the likelihood that the information contained in this article is true or false? And how do you label that? Well, it's a combination of machine learning and crowdsourcing. So there are ways to take crowdsourcing to have users flag things as false, but also to combine that with layers of verification that make sure that you're very confident that it is true or false before you label it one way or the other. If we could really create a system of labeling that is that scales through crowdsourcing, combined with human in the loop, crowdsourcing part plus the machine, intelligence part, I think that would go a long way. The thing about fake news is that whenever I see fake news come across my Facebook, it's usually preambled by, I don't know if this is true, but it's really interesting if it is, and then we share it. Well, we got to stop doing that because it's designed to be interesting if it's true, but it's not. That's the whole way that fake news is designed. And so a couple of Google searches can debunk very large fractions of fake news in just a couple of clicks. The problem with fake news is that we're not reflective. If we were more reflective, experimental research, for instance, at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy that we've conducted, that look at Dave Rand, his recent experimental stuff on cognitive reflection being useful to reduce the belief in and sharing of fake news. He does a lot of work with Pennycook. I think his name is Gordon Pennycook. Yeah. So they've been doing some fantastic lab experiments about what can reduce the spread of fake news online. He's got a new paper that looks like it could be in a big journal soon with Dean Eccles, who's another colleague of ours in the marketing department, used to work at Facebook. So we're working hard at the IDE on these topics.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to get into a couple things. One is the 2020 election and kind of what you're most concerned about. What do you think we should be doing? And secondly, there's a lot of questions coming in, in the Q&A. So feel free to post your questions to the Q&A. So we'd like to get to some of those. But before we do that, what are your thoughts or fears or concerns about the
election?
Quantifying misinformation in the election, what's being done there?
Look, the intelligence community is unanimous in that Russia interfered broadly in the 2016 election, and that B, they're doing it again right now, and that they are way more sophisticated today than they were 4 years ago. They have moved their servers to domestic soil to avoid domestic surveillance. They have stopped using inauthentic accounts, not stopped, but shifted more towards nudging real American citizens to spread fake news because of platform policies against inauthentic accounts and purges of fake accounts. They've infiltrated Iran's cyber war department, perhaps to launch attacks that look like they're coming from Tehran. And this is all happening in an election, in possibly the most consequential election year in 100 years in the United States, certainly of my generation, during a global pandemic where we have civil unrest in the streets stemming from a certainly justified movement against police brutality, but now evolving into, political clashes on the streets with, many questions about in-person voting and how safe that is, as well as many questions about at-home voting and whether that will be put through the U.S. Postal Service, as well as in general, whether it will be secure. So yeah, I'm worried. I'm very worried. I think that this is potentially, it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. You know, I've commented on publicly a few of the initiatives that Facebook and others are taking to kind of secure the integrity of the election. I think that it is very, very small efforts. I don't think these are serious. They're not going to move the needle and make the election that secure. I mean, they're basically saying a political party can't claim victory immediately afterwards, or, you know, that you can't question the safety of voting in person or the integrity of the voting process. These are not the problems that we should be facing. And I am very worried. I think that there's a number of problems that are just as unaddressed as they were in 2016.
Are there opportunities to be collecting data on what's happening here that people could be trying to take advantage of?
Yeah. So we're working with one of the two companies that was commissioned by the Senate Intelligence Committee. That was commissioned by that committee to study 2016 misinformation. And we're trying to collect data, for instance, on Twitter and Facebook about the spread of misinformation around the election and as well the coronavirus. But, you know, I think that, you know, the data collection for that kind of process requires a scaled infrastructure to be sensing all of the stuff that's being put out by known accounts, as well as immediately picking up memes that are retweeted by those accounts, even if they originate from not those known accounts. And so, you know, we have an infrastructure that we can rely on to try and collect that data. But you know, you have to really set that infrastructure up to really make it a scalable endeavor.
There's a couple of questions here that I wanted to kind of weave into one, if I can, maybe, or a two-part question. One is from Brooke. So about the digital divide. So how does the digital divide impact the perception of what is fake and what is true? And then Maureen also asks about, you know, how in the same way that platforms like Netflix give you recommendations on matches, is it possible for us to get matches on news articles and things like that that would bolster positive things like mindfulness or facilitate, you know, would those only facilitate confirmation biases? So would that be more of the same problem, or would that be a solution?
Well, so digital divide. First, I don't know of any. So there is some research in the book about the varying effects of social media on different subpopulations, for instance, men and women, or people of higher education and lower education in terms of economic opportunities, and that kind of stuff is all covered in the book. The digital divide is also covered in the sense that one of the money-based solutions that have been thrown around is this notion of just make social media a subscription service rather than run on ads. That would take away the ad-supported model, which would reduce the need to make things salacious or focus. It's the focus on engagement that creates all of the bad stuff flowing through the pipes is the basic argument. But a subscription model would obviously further the digital divide. In some countries, you know, Facebook is the internet. That's true in many African countries as well as in the Philippines and elsewhere. If you make it cost prohibitive, then you deny all of the benefits of social media, which there's a whole chapter in the book called "The Promise and the Peril of Social Media," which, or it's actually called The Promise of Social Media is also its peril, which not only describes all of the many amazing benefits social media can give us, but it also makes the important central argument in the book, which is that the source of its value is also the source of the harmful effects. And so that's what makes it difficult to regulate. When you turn down the peril, you also turn down the promise unless you do it in a nuanced way. So in that, in the book, I talk about how the subscription model could create inequality I talk about how the current design of the algorithms creates inequality of access, as well as voice share in the population. And so, yeah, I think that inequality is an important piece of this puzzle. There was an ending of that question, which is slipping my mind.
I think you covered it. I think another question from Jake is whether Facebook is Facebook being honest when it says that identifying violent content is technically difficult to do at scale. So like, are these technical problems, or are these incentive problems, or what are your thoughts on that?
It's a combination. I don't think it's technically a piece of cake to do, but it's certainly doable. I mean, 1.5 million people shared the Christchurch mass murder on Facebook. 1.2 million were picked up before they made it live by the machine. So only 300,000, which is still a lot. Only 300,000 out of 1.5 million made it through just the very basic filter of Facebook. And so I think that could get a lot better. I think that in the chapter I described the hype machine's visual cortex, which is all about its ability to sense what's in videos and what's going on in audio and video. It's incredibly sophisticated. It's going to get more sophisticated, and it does an incredibly good job of essentially doing this stuff. I think there is an accompanying incentive problem. And I think that incentive problem gets down to the lever of money and the business model, but is also interrelated to the notion of competition and regulating competition. And so all of these sort of narratives are weaved in together in the book into a what can we do question.
And it strikes me that there's so much experimentation needed to understand, well, first of all, how do you go about identifying what's misinformation versus what's misleading, and how different camps might feel about that. But then also, how do you make it so that social media is tagged in the same way you talked about? Like when you go to the store and you see the calorie labels on the food, like what would that sort of level of transparency actually look like? Is it enough to just pop the label of fake news on something, or
Well, no, I mean, I imagine, so look, we have extensive reputation scoring all over the internet. We have ratings, star ratings, reviews, user-generated content, right? So imagine if everybody had a veracity score. Just think kind of like
a user veracity score.
Yeah, a user veracity score. Think at the 30,000 foot level. Imagine if we all had veracity scores and we were all trying to get 5 out of 5. We were trying to get our veracity scores to 5 out of 5, which means that the stuff that we put out is fact checked to be reliable. That's an easy summary. And imagine that, 4 billion people on social media were putting these labels, and the machine was working through them to kind of like test the reliability of these labels so that they're not gamed. They're very good at not gaming ratings and removing fraudulent ratings. So why can't we have a veracity score? That really does. Now, okay. I mean, that when I say that to you, it sounds, you're like, oh, okay, we do have all these labels. We do have all the ratings in the world and so on. That could work. And then your mind immediately goes to, but there are problems. Yeah. And so one of the major problems is that at the very bottom, one of the things that makes this so difficult is at the very bottom of all of that is a need to define what's true and what's false. And the big question is, who gets to decide what's true and what's false?
Or if there are errors. Yeah.
Or what?
If there's some errors and who gets tagged. Yeah. Exactly. Any percentage of error would be a problem.
Exactly. There are ethical questions at the very fundamental base of all of this that need to be answered, philosophical questions. I'll tell you, I think, if we get to the point where we're having a debate about it at that level of sophistication, where it's like, okay, we've got this veracity system, it's scaled, it seems to be working pretty well, but, we've got to get better at, the errors, et cetera. If we're having that conversation 24 months from now, I'll be ecstatic, like that'll be pretty good, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so we're about to wrap up here, but wanted to kind of, I guess, ask you your final question of like, what do you see going forward? How are you feeling going forward? What are your thoughts about what social media could become in the future? Is there any kind of inspiration you can leave us with, or is it,
I hope that's enough.
Yeah, is that enough to go on? What do you want to say in your last?
Yeah, your final words.
I'm hopeful. Okay, so this book is not another doom and gloom book about social media. I think we have had enough of those. I think, the social dilemma is let's make that a bookend of the doom and gloom of social media. This book is about how do we create a better future, and with real science under the hood and with very specific, non-generic suggestions for what the what the three main stakeholders can do: the policymakers, laws, regulation, the platforms, and the people, the users themselves. What can these three stakeholders concretely do to achieve the promise and avoid the peril? And it's a hopeful book. The book, I believe that we can and we will start to move in the right direction. We will suffer if we don't, and we will suffer some continued negative consequences as it's currently unfolding today. But we really do need to think about how to move forward, and that's what this book really tries to do.
Fantastic. Wonderful, wonderful. So, so for those of you who enjoyed this, we're going to post a quick survey to get your thoughts and feedback on this. But Sinan, we just want to thank you so much in terms of, furthering the research and furthering understanding of what's happening, and just some really great questions for us to all be thinking about. I have a bunch of stuff that I want to go now think about. So really grateful for your time. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote this for the scholars and nerds like myself, as well as for the broader public. And so I really do expect and hope that the research community will take this up as a piece of that conversation. This is not intended to just be kind of a general audience book. It is a serious scholarly piece of, it's really a summary of the last 20 years of what do we know in this area as well. And so, hopefully it'll kickstart some research or push some research forward.